Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us in today's session. My name is Paul Curry. I'm the Associate Director for the Urban Systems Center at ICLEI Africa. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to our session today entitled Levering Partnerships for Circular Development. This is part 3 of our series, Building Capacity for Circular Economy Innovation, that's co-convened with Stellenbosch University Launch Lab, the African Circular Economy Network, and generously funded by the Embassy of Finland to South Africa through the Fund for Local Cooperation. I'm very excited for today's discussion. We've got two great colleagues joining us for their provocations. Yame Nkowe, who'll speak to experiences with partnership development in Botswana, and Brett Cohen, who will speak to his experience in EPR through the greenhouse. Just a reminder that by participating in this webinar session, you're consenting to be recorded. And we encourage you to introduce yourself in chat and share some of your thoughts and questions throughout the session. We have the pleasure of being joined by our colleague, Yame Nkowe, founder of the Sustainable Cities Africa organization and the country rep for the African Circular Economy Network in Botswana, as well as Brett Cohen, who's the director of the Greenhouse, who'll provide their insights into building partnerships. I'd like us to do a Zoom shower in which we share the keywords that come to mind when we think about meaningful partnerships and what it takes to build meaningful partnerships. So for those who haven't done the Zoom shower, we're going to take 30 seconds to write in 1 or 2 keywords, but don't send it yet. And when I say go, we'll all click enter and they'll come through. So the brief keywords that come to mind when you meaningful partnership. Add in 2 words here. So it's not a link, it's just into the chat. You can type a keyword that comes to mind on how you build meaningful partnerships. And then I'll say go, and we can all click enter, and they'll all come through in what a colleague has called a Zoom shower, which I found a fun way to get a broad set of insights. So if we're already written our keywords, I'll click go, and they'll come through. So from my side, I wrote time and trust. Symbiotic relationships, networks, trust, cooperation, rigorous needs assessments, mutual understanding, trust and networking, honesty, joint vision, ecosystem building, trust, network, outside the box, just to stay on Zoom, win-win, trust, openness, knowledge sharing, participatory development, accountability, transparency. Thank you all for sharing, and I think this sets a really nice foundation for the touch points that we must have through this conversation. So with that, we're going to invite our 2 speakers to offer some insights from each of their work, and then we'll open for discussion amongst everyone in the link. So can I invite Yame to share reflections on partnering from Botswana?
Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, welcome to this session. I'm very glad to be here. First of all, in my capacity as founder of Sustainable Cities Africa. Basically, we are here looking to promote the co-creation or the facilitated co-creation of sustainable city strategies and promote sustainable cities in a Botswana context, but also obviously in a wider Southern African context. I'm also here in my capacity, both as, funny enough, the ICLEI Africa communities of practice on promoting circular African cities, and also as the country representative for Botswana in the African Circular Economy Network. So this is really a great opportunity to share the work that I've been up to, but also more importantly, where we are at this point. But I think just before I get into what I perhaps believe is of key consideration when we're looking at partnership building and ecosystem building. I really want us, because I don't believe you are empty vessels, I really want us to contextualize where we are when we're talking about capacity building and looking at circular economy innovation. When you look at this, you really need to consider, I think I would like to just give you this consideration. When you think about circular economy and where we are and how it needs to grow, you need to consider the difference between two key questions. And this is, do you want to see change or do you want to change? Because on the one hand, the issue of circular economy is very, I think it's one of the hottest topics currently, globally anywhere. But the reality of it is that the principle is maybe well understood, but the practice is not, is still in its nascent stage. And what I really believe where that comes in is that we need to really, really take a deep look at ourselves and realize that this is probably the single most important moment that we're in and moving forward. So issues of circular economy, for example, issues of climate action and resilience and adaptation, and also contributing to a green economy. These kind of things are things which, no matter where you are, you have to find a way to play a part in them. So it's about you, your contribution as well, no matter what the interface or you have with that. Then the second thing I really want to really highlight, and the reason why we're all here as part of this platform, is really that we need to really think about what is our voice. And what I mean by this is not what is the African narrative. You know, people like to talk about these issues, but when you hear, let's say, your mother talking or your brother talking, you know their voice, you hear it. So why, when we talk about circular economy in an African context, are we hearing an African voice? So when you hear somebody talking somewhere, are you hearing is that this is something coming from Africa? So it's even when you express issues of the not only the challenges, but also how we're going to move forward, you should be hearing that, yes, this sounds like something that is coming from a local context or local context. So this is very critical, the African narrative. Then I think the last bit and the most important bit, and that's really around the issues that we need to realize that we all, because we all have a part to play and we're looking to express an African narrative, is that you need to find a way to, we really need to move from the principle of it to the practice. And like the name says, circular economy. What that means is that until you make it the business of business, where it's actually now doing what it should be doing, which is the actual transformation, the deep transformation of economies and industries and everything else. And it's really now hitting home into our relationship with the environment around us, our relationship with natural resources, not waste, because I think that's where we're stuck now. We're looking at this upcycling and things like that. But how do we use it so that we're actually transforming how we think about our relationship with products and services, how we're actually now designing the out waste in everything that we do. So everything across the economic landscape, whether it's agricultural, whether it's transport, mobility, housing, all that, it needs to deeply transform. And we all have a part to play. So I think really this is, for me, that's where we really need to contextualize there. So when you look at the work that, if I just want to talk to capacity building and also the work that I've been doing in terms of partnerships and ecosystem building, in not only in Botswana, but also possibly in a wider African context, the single most important partnership I would say that I've had up until now has been actually the first one. My mentor and technical partner, Mr. Alan Mayo, who is based in London in the UK. Somewhere around 2015, 16, I reached out to him and said, look, we are urbanizing, we're potentially facing a climate crisis here, but I don't get the sense that we are actually telling our own story and framing these conversations our own way. So it's on this journey where we're actually seeing how we can actually contextualize sustainable cities in an African context, that I actually got to understand really deeply, that to move faster, you have to move together. So that you don't always have to come up with the idea yourself. You can actually, as we do now, collaboration is the new business development. You can collaborate to actually move a lot quicker, get access to deeper networks and get insights. So that platform, that's where I got to now, as the issues became a little bit more pronounced in an African context. And I'm talking about drivers here. We're talking now about social enterprise and the social economy. We're talking about the circular economy. We're talking about, we're now talking about issues around digital transformation and leaving no one behind. But all of these things are playing out in an urban context. And this is where really, for me, this is where now it brought me to my next entry point. This is where the African Circular Economy Network was actually starting around 2018, was starting to pick up. And I got invited to actually become a rep in the Botswana context and learn a bit more about what these issues of circularity are. So it's actually a learning by doing process, but that wouldn't have been possible if now I was actually looking to collaborate, engage in ecosystem building, and make those issues that were coming up, relate them to my work. And I think it's along this journey, a lot of the entities you see now on an African context, in the context of circular economy, they all took a chance. They said, this is a very deep problem and we actually have to tell the African story. We actually have to have context in an African context. So this is where you're seeing the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, you're seeing EPR Africa, you're seeing Footprints Africa, you're now hearing of the African Circular Economy Alliance, all these entities, and these accelerators, like the wonderful work that they're doing in South Africa with Fatola and Stellenbosch Launch Lab. These entities didn't just come about by chance, because upon the journey where everybody said, no, we are going to tell our own story and we're going to find a way. Now, because we're engaging, this is when platforms like this are coming out. And this now brings me to where I am. And just so at least I wrap up from a Botswana perspective. Now, along this journey over the course of 3 years, not only dealing with the material, but also now being able to go out, engage with entities like our councils, looking at the Green Building Council, which is fairly new, the Business Botswana, which are Chamber of Commerce and government departments. The issue of, okay, fine, but let's contextualize this in a Botswana context, over and above the reports, the wonderful reports that have been written on the Pan-African lens. You're seeing issues around circularity in cities. All these issues now, we wanted to bring it home and say, okay, fine, how do we take these principles and move to action? So this is where I am now. I'm glad to say that the African Circular Economy Network Foundation, since it's coming into being about 18 months ago, we're at a state of readiness to do what is called the Circular Economy Roadmap for Botswana. So I think they're bringing their partnerships to bear. And my job really as the rep here is to actually now engage with the networks, create that environment where conversations can happen, and really now start to show how collaboration and how ecosystem building, everyone can play their part, but really now it's how do you do that in a more integrated fashion? And more importantly, now start to bring these issues of circular economy innovation, bring about. And innovation doesn't always mean coming up with something new. It means also you need to do what you're doing, but maybe it's how you think about it. Now it's changed the way you think about it, how you relate, so you can actually do that transition and contribute to the transition, so that we can actually bring it home and affect the local economy in our green transition here in Botswana. So I think with those thoughts, I think let me just pause there, because I am sure there will be other perspectives from other speakers, but thank you for that.
Thank you so much. And I think your opening provocation, might represent something quite deep about the circular economy as seeking systems transformation. So, and I think what you've reflected, oddly enough for me, brought out a question of introspection. Are we thinking deeply about what a transition means directly for, I think I paused. Are we thinking deeply about what a circular economy transition means for us as individuals? If we're successful in this, what does it mean about the lifestyles that we're seeking? And so I think you've shaped quite a lovely journey for us of an interpersonal relationship with the mentor into the sense of organizations towards seeing now the opportunity to develop a circular economy roadmap. Those types of initiatives are arriving, and this fruition of this talk of circular economy into some real action, which I think is really interesting to comment on. I'd like to invite those joining us to throw questions or comments into chat. In the meantime, we'll hear from Brett Cohen, about his experiences building partnerships through the greenhouse. Welcome, Brett.
Thanks, Paul. And hopefully you can see I've thrown together a couple of slides. Can you just confirm that you can see the right version this time? So I'm going to take, great, thank you very much. So good to meet you all. My name is Brett Cohen, as has been indicated. I work for a consultancy based in Cape Town, South Africa, called The Greenhouse. We're a sustainability consultancy working across all elements of sustainability, I guess. We do work in climate change, quite extensive work in climate mitigation rather than adaptation or impact. And then we also work in aspects related to the circular economy and life cycle analysis. So the work that I want to talk to you about is actually based on a project that we did that was funded by a program called the EU South Africa Partners for Growth Program. So it's an EU funded program. And what we were asked to do was look at extended producer responsibility as one of the tools that could be used to help support the circular economy within the basket of tools that I think can be used in this regard. So I guess I come at it at a slightly different angle from Yame, looking at a specific intervention, a specific policy intervention, and then use that to understand how that can be supported by partnerships. I'm going to talk about the different kinds of partnerships that could perhaps support extended producer responsibility interventions. So for those of you that haven't come across the policy tool, I'm going to be just give you a very brief overview of extended producer responsibility and how it works, and then talk about the scales of action, and then talk about the opportunities for small businesses and collaboration. So to dive straight into it, EPR is, as I mentioned, a policy tool that has been designed to make, or a set of tools actually, to help make manufacturers accountable for the end-of-life impacts of products. So it's really trying to encompass the whole chain from design and manufacture all the way through to end-of-life management of a range of products. And through doing so, to help to encourage the manufacturers to think about aspects like eco-design and design to ensure that these products are able to be recovered or reused or recycled at the end of their lives. So rather than just thinking about the product having gone out of the manufacturer's door and sold, and they're not worrying about what its environmental impact is subsequently. And of course, by doing so, we are supporting more circular economy thinking in the design of these products. And I'm going to highlight how these provide opportunities for small businesses, for how this kind of program can identify opportunities for small businesses. I mean, EPR is largely being touted, I guess, as a policy tool, but there are also voluntary EPR programs that are seen around the world. So, for example, we have very high recovery of plastic water bottles, PET water bottles in South Africa, and that's supported largely by voluntary EPR programs that are not necessarily a part of legislation and regulated. So what kinds of policy approaches can be found under EPR? Well, I mean, as many references, sources as there are on EPR, so you can find different permutations and combinations of these. But I think this is quite a nice summary of the kinds of policy interventions, which one can look at. So, I mean, the one can think about is product take back, where the person at the end of the life, the purchaser at the end of the life, is able to return the product to the person that they bought it from for recycling and disposal. So an example here is renewable energy infrastructure in Europe as being, they are requiring producers or importers of renewable energy infrastructure to take back solar panels, or starting to get there on wind turbines, in order to recycle them at the end of life. So that's just a law. Somebody arrives at your door and gives you a solar panel, you have to take it back and responsibly manage it. I think many of us have come across deposit and refund schemes where you buy your beer and your cold drink in a glass or a plastic bottle, and then you'll get 10 cents or 50 cents. I don't know what the going rate is when you take it back to the shop at the end of its life. And then rather than needing to be recycled, it can often just be washed and refilled. And certainly at various times, different kinds of bottles have seen these kinds of deposit refund schemes. And these have been around for many, many years with different levels of success in their implementation. A third example of EPR is when you have advanced disposal fees, where a producer pays the cost of disposal at the end of the life at the beginning. So they say, okay, this is going to cost this amount to dispose of, and you pay a fee up front, which helps producers to think about obviously avoiding disposal and perhaps recovering the product at the end of the life if there's an opportunity to avoid those fees. And a similar linked opportunities, imposing taxes or offering subsidies around which link to the product composition or the volume, again, to help change designs. And then a final one, which is slightly different to the others that I've identified, is when you implement minimum recycling requirements. So you say that there's a minimum recycled content in a product, which then stimulates a market for the recyclate. So if you say plastic bags need 10% recyclate in them, then they're going to have to be people who are recovering enough recyclate at the end of plastic life to supply the need for making plastic bags out of recycled content. So you'll see it's quite a range of interventions which one thinks about, but all towards a common aim of increasing the circularity of products in the economy. And we are starting to see examples of this on the continent. So South Africa has relatively recently implemented EPR regulation, which covers a reasonable host of products, ranging from electronic and electrical equipment through to lighting, and of course, paper packaging and certain single-use products. So we're in the throes of implementing that at the moment, and various mechanisms for doing that. We can talk about that during the discussion period if we want. And Kenya actually has a very comprehensive list of products that is covered by their also recently introduced EPR legislation. Go on, you can read the list there. So it's quite a long list of products that are covered by EPR regulation, and again different processes like the ones that I put in place there. So that's just a bit of a background to EPR and the fact that it's already starting to be rolled out in support of the circular economy in Africa. But I think when we get now onto the idea of partnerships and collaboration, I think it's valuable to recognize that EPR requires coordinated action at all levels. And one might not think of, immediately of the global, where does global action, global coordinated action arise? And this is really about understanding what the composition of products are. So one of the big challenges with recovery of products and management of products at end of life is knowing what is in those products and ensuring that those responsible for recovery and recycling are not going to be unnecessarily exposed to hazardous chemicals, and that people know what they're managing and what they need to do with those products. So there's definitely a need for global collaboration and coordination around disclosure of products. And one of the tools that's actually being used here is something called product passports, where your product literally comes with its passport, which says what's in it. And I noticed, I think a few days ago, others might have noticed this as well, or perhaps it was late last week, that the EU has finally passed the legislation around requiring product passports for a number of different products. So when you import it, or when they import it, you know exactly what's in it. Of course, EPR is supported by national legislation, as per the examples I showed you of South Africa and Kenya and many other parts of the world. And this is what defines how EPR is to be implemented, which products, who's responsible, the stakeholders, legal liability, etc. So that's some coordination there and collaboration there. But of course, the kind of on-the-ground implementation will be the domain of the private sector, municipalities, NGOs, and the general public. So I think this multi-tier implementation is an interesting one in terms of the supporting circular economy. So what are the opportunities for collaboration? And I'm going to highlight global collaboration, and then I'm going to talk specifically around SMEs. And I think one of the things we've got to recognize is that there is extensive global experience in implementation of EPR, and particularly in Europe. So Europe's been doing this for, I think, 2 or 3 decades, if I'm not mistaken. And there is some emerging experience in South Africa and Kenya and other places. And so it's important that we don't try and reinvent the wheel, because implementation of EPR is challenging. If you think about trying to get dispersed products in the economy back to some sort of central process for recovery and recycling and the rest, it's going to take very complex systems, or relatively complex systems. So the global collaboration opportunities include those with product suppliers who need to support the end-of-life recovery. There are the consultancies, notably in Europe, who have experience in the implementation of EPR schemes, including software for tracking material flows. We can talk about that a bit more. There are also consultancies who have experience on the technology that is required to recover materials end of life. However, we must ensure that we don't just get dumped with European technologies that are not relevant in the local context and fit for purpose. And then finally, the kind of technologies and systems for dismantling, recovery, recycling. So those two overlap a bit. And then my last slide, I realize I'm approaching my time slot, Paul, but noting that there are definitely opportunities for SMEs on the ground. You know, a lot of those international global collaborations might be more relevant to bigger companies and national governments and that kind of thing. But on the ground, we need the people who are there to, first of all, design products for reduced impact on the environment, recycling, recovery, to meet all of these legislative requirements. We're going to need people to manage the end-of-life recovery. SMEs play a big role here in materials collection, dismantling, processing, sale to markets, and then manufacture of products from the recovered material to close that loop. And then finally, SMEs can play a role in the development and support of the IT systems that are required to help track these flows of material in society and in the environment. So there are a number of opportunities which we can build on in this particular area of circular economy. So those are my talking points. Just if I may, to acknowledge our funders once again, the EU SA Partners for Growth Programme with EU funding. So that's me. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Brett, for the insights on EPR, and nice to see it broken into some more digestible ways in which you can compel end-of-life responsibility. I think at this point, maybe to open for questions from our participants, if you'd like clarification of anything or like to pose a question directly. We've shaped this webinar to be a meeting form, so you can raise hands and turn your screen on so it's a bit more personable. So if anyone would like to share their reflections, maybe raise your hand. Maybe to start us off, I think what I've taken from Yame is the sense of building personal relationships and growing a movement. And what I'm hearing from Brett is the idea of how you compel relationships or through legislation or voluntary approaches. True. So maybe if I can ask you each to reflect on each other's inputs, I think that would be valuable.
Sorry, Paul, you did break up there for a moment.
How is EPR considered in?
I think you broke up there for a moment. Would you mind repeating a moment?
Sure. So my takeaway from Yame's input was on interpersonal relationships, building into collaboration and relationship between organizations, do advocacy work around the ideas of the circular economy. And what's framed in your input, Brett, was how a legislation of voluntary agreements can shape or require collaboration out of necessity. And so if I could ask Yami to reflect on the state of EPR perhaps in Botswana and how these types of legislation might help take the advocacy movements into real change.
I think an instrument like EPR, as wonderful as it is, you have to realize two things. Botswana sits in the middle of the SADC region and is largely a land-linked country. So it imports basically everything. It literally impacts it. So it has a very low manufacturing base. So the ability to influence what goes into the product or how they're designed, it's fairly limited, unless of course there's probably real legislation around the planting these kind of enforcement measures at the border. So basically as part of the standards-based approach. So it has to be a voluntary. If I was going to say it very direct, it would have to be a voluntary thing, so that you look at exactly what is your import book looking like, looking at key priority sectors where waste is being generated, for example, whether it's electronic, whether it's foodstuffs or whatever, plastics, everything else, and then enable that through that voluntary EPR program, so that people can show their support for the I would say the regeneration or the green transition for Botswana. But in the absence of the same, I think one thing that I saw from Brett's list that is perhaps a little bit, I wouldn't say missing, but it's something that's absolutely necessary. There's this movement towards designing technical assistance facilities, so that you actually now start to design the actual support for understanding and transitioning to comply with these standards and the understanding of these things, but also now, how do you prepare people to be ready so that they can actually now start to play a part? So the investment readiness of it, so the TA to support with seed funding. So this is more also to enable government spend, or government to consider how it actually looks to, if it wants to take, I don't know, a green bond, where would it actually now extend this kind of long-term kind of investment, which maybe doesn't do a payback in relation to maybe investability of it, but it lays that very solid so like a groundwork or fundamentals to actually support the green transition by enabling either standards to be adopted, or enable for these large scale anchor type of I'd say kind of producers to actually buy in, because you're enabling it through incentivization and the like. So I think Botswana wouldn't be in a very strong position because we have a low manufacturing base, but we are land linked. But enforcement is actually required. But again, this comes back to the point I was trying to make this is why we've taken this more integrated, holistic approach to say, look, potentially a circular economy roadmap for the country is the way to go, because when you do that, you're bringing all partners together and see what the policy challenges and barriers are, also looking specifically at where are the priorities, which sectors are actually where the focus needs to be. And again, just like EPR, we are, and this is the last point, we actually landfilling incineration has been for the longest our primary way to deal with waste. So now it's about how do you start to use other instruments, like say these items cannot be allowed to go to the landfill. So now you're actually starting to enable through, again, policy instruments, but now, again, TA facilities, so programmatic type interventions and sort of homegrown solutions and partnerships can actually start to play a part. So yeah, that would be my take on it.
Thanks. What I'm hearing is the ability of Botswana to enforce things across its borders, or enforce manufacturing processes across its borders, are quite difficult. But putting limits on what's allowed across those borders could be a way in. Brett, any reflections? Otherwise, I'll invite Tavens to offer a provocation.
Sure. I mean, I think Emma's point is good. In South Africa, the way that's handled, because we do import a lot, is that it's either the manufacturer or the importer who's responsible for the EPR elements of it. But I would agree with you. You need a sufficient market to justify the implementation of the legislation, because it is costly and it is quite data intensive and challenging to track. And so perhaps South Africa does have a bigger market, and as you say, a bigger manufacturing base that justifies those kind of border considerations to be put into place. And then it requires, as I said, the importers to go and interact with their suppliers and have a look at what they're importing and what the components of those products are. So yeah, so I think I think EPR is relevant in some contexts and not in others. Some have argued that it is very complex to implement in South Africa, and we should be trying other approaches. So it does depend on context and viewpoint and value and that kind of thing. In terms of your question, I think originally, Paul, as to my feeling on kind of the voluntary partnership. Sure, I think that circular economy is such a multifaceted concept and has so many aspects that need to be implemented. I think it's a combination of building those voluntary and kind of co-creation kind of opportunities, but coupled with legislation to help guide certain management of certain issues and ensure that the key challenging materials or high resource intensity materials or energy materials or hazard materials are managed through some sort of legislative process, and to build on existing government legislation to close those loops. Yeah, I think that's my response to those two questions.
Thanks. Thanks. Taven, would you like to share your question?
Yes, can you hear me clearly?
Mm.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, please proceed.
Great. So I think the speed and the scale of what we are going to have to do is obviously completely unprecedented in our age. And it crosses every aspect of our lives. The circular economy is one small part of a whole jigsaw of things that need to come together: biodiversity, gender, energy use, whatever you want to add into this, all parts of the same picture that has to change. And it has to change so dramatically and at such speed. So we should recognize that nothing is off the table. Everything must be possible. So if we're going to get to anywhere close to dealing with it, we have to find ways of getting speed and scale, replicating things, finding ways of doing things really quickly. So you have to have integration from the thought of how you can do it to the execution. You've got to tie the thing together. You can't allow market forces to drive the different components. If you look at what we were able to do for COVID in terms of the scale of the dramatic shift made, what is required now is even greater than that. That's the provocation.
Not to pun, but this theme around creativity, agency, and urgency, specifically around that point. We need to act yesterday, but how do we do so while maintaining the importance of building partnerships, allowing people to express their own identities, and doing so in creative and innovative ways? And that tension point is really difficult to navigate. And I think coming back to what Yame has offered right in the beginning, seeing change versus changing, I'm caught on that idea, becomes really difficult. And Taven, you're absolutely right. After this pandemic, no one can say that rapid and radical change cannot happen, because we did it. So how can we apply those ideas to the agendas around circular economy, equity, and inclusive urbanization? Absolutely. Do either of you want to respond to Taven's provocation?
I mean, nothing specific, but I suppose my answer would be, so I agree with you entirely. I think it does have to have happened last week or last year. I guess it's a combination of building the partnerships and building the voluntary actions, which needs to take place from the bottom up, and getting all stakeholders involved, and communities involved, and private sector involved, and government involved. But then I think at the same time, it does need to be complemented by the legislation to really protect us from the hazardous materials that are entering into the environment, or to slow down the disposal of waste and resources to landfill. So we do need those legislative actions just to put a real stop to the linear economy. And so I think it's a combination of interventions.
Yes, my contribution would be along the same lines. I mean, really, we all have to play our part. Wherever you are, you could be in the financial service sector, you could be dealing with tax, you could be dealing with the educational reform. It does not matter. You need to be playing your part in some capacity. I was actually part of a network that was actually growing fairly recently. It's what's called Recirculate. It was an initiative of Lancaster University with 6 other African universities to actually see about using water as a reference point for now promoting circular economy, because it's a base of everything else. So whether it's in the construction, the food and agriculture and everything else, but how do you think about that using water? But they were developing work packets around knowledge sharing. They were doing research and sharing African best practice. They were also looking at how to use universities as a platform for knowledge transfer, to capacitate SMMEs, to strengthen them towards eco-innovation. And then also now looking at what do you call entrepreneurship and innovation, where they were looking to say, look, how can we now start to create new entities as a result of all this sharing, all these things. So you can see that the universities are trying, but now that needs to be, again, happening at scale. Now also you have the African Circular Economy Alliance coming in, saying governments come together, secretariat, let's see how we can harmonize our initiatives and the like. But you see, that is all well and good. But you see, now I saw somebody dropped into the chat about the African Circular Economy facility. Now, yeah, that facility is maybe for some countries and think we also, governments need to use these as maybe say, okay, fine, if there's a grant funding mechanism, how do I also now build the ability to tap into something like that and now complement with what I have in my budget? Because I think a lot of times we miss this, like a government, like let's say, I don't know, South Africa might have a budget of 200 billion. But just to give it a number, 200 billion in a year, that's the annual budget. So how much of that is aligned towards issues around this legislation, policy reform, stimulating green transition? How do you show your climate ambition, have KPIs, and also now start to incentivize co-creation and partnerships to be happening, so that issues related to maybe transformation of local authorities, industries, all these, they're being seed funded, so the technical assistance and seed funding for projects which can actually do large scale transformation. How do they? Then entrepreneurs, how do you now try to help them with their methodologies, their operating systems, and who's playing that space? I see Launch Lab and Vetola and the like, accelerators, they have a role to play, but now that means accelerators also, you should not be having VCs or foundations with funding over there and then accelerators over there. There must be funding tied to accelerators, so that now, as soon as the investment readiness and the methodology design and demo days, there's seed funding pots, so that people see that accelerators are working, their methodologies work, but there's seed funding. So, but then this still comes back to Brett's point. If the governments are not aligned to say, well, let's do obviously policy hacks or whatever to now iterate around policy reform, they don't, maybe that's not front of mind. But if they have non-state actors who are informing through, just like we've done with COVID, this scientific evidence that everyone's talking with climate, we must have the same thing for circular economy, for thing where there's that back to science to actually say this is what it looks like. So that support from non-state actors is absolutely critical, so that the policy reform can actually be a little more tactical as well, so that they can start to embed these things, so they can see what is my context in Namibia, in Eswatini, in Zambia. They really has. I love Brett's opening thing. There's global standards now. There's coalitions, but really at the local level, how do you bring those down so that they're really cooked in, or if I can baked in into what happens at the local level? It's absolutely critical that happens. Yeah.
Mm. You know, we started by talking about this sort of movement of circular economy initiatives going on, and you cited a number of acceleration programs, including ACE. So your provocation, your point is governments need to capitalize now on the fact that these systems are being built and need to start investing in pots of seed funding to take this forward, which I think is a very apt point. Just to pass some questions from the chat onto Brett, I'm going to couple two of them together. Matthew's remarked that he's happy to see policies and associated mechanisms coming into play in South Africa, but they need to be matched with consumer awareness around separation at source and the infrastructure to support this awareness and collection. Is there enough happening on this awareness raising infrastructure to support the policies? Or does that come after you've got the policies or in line? And from Joanna, I'm curious to know how we avoid these EPR costs being passed on to customers, effectively preventing lower income customers from being able to access goods and services. So how can they be funded in a way that creates a win-win?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, let me give a bash to both of those. I mean, it's up to I think that you're right, that for many of the products, there needs to come into place. There's the EPR legislation, and then it will be up to the product suppliers, those responsible for implementation, to create the awareness around it. So if a particular product falls under EPR legislation, then the awareness will need to be created around its recovery. What's quite interesting there is that invariably it's not the individual suppliers of products that are making themselves responsible for recovery. So what they rather do is they set up what's called a producer responsibility organization, a PRO. And that is an organization, an independent organization, often a coming together of various private sector suppliers, and they will pay money to that PRO to be responsible for the implementation of the EPR legislation. So that PRO will often create the education campaigns and to support the implementation. So for example, Petco in South Africa, the PET bottles, has done a lot of the advertising and the consumer awareness about the value of PET bottles, and I think that's where that's what happens there. So hopefully I've answered that question. I think EPR costs are unfortunately passed on to consumers indirectly. I suppose
I think we've just lost Brett's internet. Maybe 10 seconds to see if he comes back. So maybe while we wait for Brett to return, I was going to ask him to follow up on another question about data and IT, and then shift the conversation to knowledge sharing and data sharing platforms. And Yame, you noted that as part of this technical assistance, and I wonder if you have some pointers for us on what type of knowledge sharing platforms work, and how you facilitate these, particularly because circular economy is developed in many different contexts. And how do you facilitate these platforms while retaining what you mentioned as this contextual perspective? So how do we learn from those that are implementing effectively, but also ensure that our own voice is guiding this?
Funny enough, we already have a lot of these initiatives, but it's like, how do you shine a light on them so that they actually get that attention that they deserve? There's an African Circular Economy Research Group where African universities just loosely gathering to share, collaborate on the issues of circular economy. Ellen MacArthur Foundation and I think Eclair Africa have done a wonderful job in terms of the knowledge sharing project, just like this Rise Africa, around the circular African cities. You're seeing a lot of initiatives really around around I saw the what's called that trinomics report on the EU Commission report on opportunities for circular economy for EU. So this was more I think it was more geared towards how the EU would bring about this EU Green Deal when the EU Africa partnership. So how do you create that vehicle for this? So the thing about it is that you find that when we start to shift from principle to the practice, a lot of these also like ecosystems or communities of practice need to be scaled up to become almost thematic working groups, whereby, for example, that knowledge sharing, where there's maybe there's a entrusted central not repository, but that one actor who on behalf of the rest is entrusted. So it could be I think Brett was talking about a PRO. That's more clustering. How do you cluster this knowledge sharing? So you shine a light on, you entrust that, so that now those mechanisms now become the de facto kind of place for where all this knowledge is brought together in order to be now more shared at scale. So that therefore, for example, you can see that in Southern Africa, in West Africa, for example, in East Africa, this is the picture, you know. So I know there's a lot of country reports. The reason why I talk about country reports is that, for example, you find that in any of the support mechanisms we have, whether from, I don't know, a World Bank or a UNDP or whatever, when you have, for example, what we're trying to do here in Botswana as part of the circular economy roadmap, what we want to do at the end is also purpose design a circular economy agency. So this would be the entity responsible for implementation. So part of that will have to be knowledge sharing, so that any other partner who wants to get maybe a perspective when activity happens. And to really get home to your point, there was this initiative that I recently learned about called CREST. CREST is a circular economy research that was done across the whole of the EU, where they were looking at they were unpacking absolutely everything in relation to the measurement and the improvement of measurement of what's called of the circular economy. What could KPIs look like, indicators, what could policy reform, barriers, challenges. So they really unpacked it across various work packets, but they're also now looking to see how they can collaborate here. I think Footprints Africa is the partner for that, but EU funding obviously has to kick in, because we don't have the scale for anything of that technical nature to actually do it here. But the reality is that when initiatives like this come to the fore, how do you then either partner or anything like that, so that you can actually now, through maybe, for example, the circular economy agency that we're talking about in Botswana, partner for share, this is the Botswana perspective, and then Niger doing it, and then Senegal doing it, so that you actually now bring out that local knowledge, so that everyone's perspectives are. And this is where I think the beauty of it comes in, is that when we're doing this at scale, the platforms themselves should actually now start to come out. Because what you're actually talking to, the real question you're actually asking is like, you're unpacking value chains. You're actually unpacking value chains. So you're actually showing where the skills readiness needs to be, where the job opportunities, where the new kind of initiatives need to come out. So when it's not just about sharing ideas, but how do you now test out ideas and make it, I don't know, applied research and things like that. But also more importantly, where do chambers of commerce need to play a part, for example, industry bodies? So they take this scientific evidence, this research, and actually, okay, because this research has been done, but there's an opportunity for partnerships. Let's use that to inform how we, let's say, it could be the battery sector, it could be the manufacturing sector, the plastics. How do we inform our own transition? But you see, a new partnership is forming right there. The knowledge has been shared, the research is now coming to the industry body, and that's what's informing a green transition. And when you do that, what's actually happening then, the industry body or the individual businesses now, when they apply for funding or anything like that, they can actually now show evidence that this is the journey I'm trying to go on, I'm trying to do this project. So now you're actually attracting project finance, you see, based on that, first from the idea, the sharing, the evidence, everything. Now you propose new ideas for even how you work or how you drive project implementation or project preparation, for example. So now you show alignment, that it's because we're trying to align to this new implementation roadmap, reduce this kind of challenges that we're facing. So therefore, we're going down this path. Now you're creating a whole new issues that Brett was talking to now start to come into the picture. Yeah. So I don't know, that sounds a lot, but really these are the dynamics at play here. Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, the takeaway I have from this is again, mobilizing these partnerships to drive knowledge towards industry players so that when they're ready, they can see that there's available information for them to actually start capitalizing on. Brett, you dropped off, I think, as you were speaking about passing the costs on to consumers, but I want to just add another question, and you hinted at it in your presentation, on how data and IT systems can support EPR and how we track those flows and enforce them. Yeah,
thanks for that. Apologies for dropping off. I'm not sure what happened there. So, Garth, definitely data and IT support, IT systems are at the heart of EPR schemes. And I think that's one of the biggest learnings from the EU that we could perhaps take on board in Africa, is that you have to have those tracking systems set up at the start of an EPR scheme. Without that data, it's impossible to implement. And there are, as I said, a couple of specialists who we've spoken to. All they do is they set up data and IT systems for tracking material flows through the economy. I think in the absence of those, it would be an implementation nightmare. Yeah, and those are often taken on board by the PROs or by the government, depending on how the scheme is operated. They will operate those systems to ensure that all the material that you should be accounting for is tracked.
Thanks, and you know, those are often the entry points for most of the circular economy roadmaps that are being developed, is to try and do a full metabolic profiling. But often those infrastructures aren't available and are overlooking the flows that are moving in decentralized ways. So I think something we're trying to consider is how do we provide guidance in these roadmaps? Yes, for setting up these systems and ensuring that there's support for the IT consultants who can do that, but also in acknowledging those hidden systems. Is my internet playing up now too?
Paul, if I may jump on that, but you just threw in a word, the Metabolic. For those who do not know Metabolic in Amsterdam, honestly, these are one of the type of organizations you need to be following if you want to play a space, because a lot of the issues that Paul is talking to, you're talking about building the infrastructure, basically. Brett is hinting to the IT system and the support technologies. These are the kind of entities who are trying to build that plumbing or that underlying mechanics for this type of support. And you know, a lot of times, you know, a lot of people, youth especially, or even those who have gone and done their masters or their PhDs, they finish their PhD, but then they don't know, where can I go from here? It's exactly people like yourselves. If you've done that research, you have that capacity. Now look to see, how do I address this infrastructure? How do I address this plumbing that will support the wider ecosystem support? That's where the opportunities lie. So the value chain and the strengthening of ecosystems is absolutely critical. But you need to now research, see how others are doing it elsewhere, so that you see, okay, if I was going to play a part and locally contextualize here, what could it look like? And I think Metabolic is just one of those very good examples of kind of entities who are doing a fantastic job. But now we need to be building our own metabolics here in an African context, so that the plumbing gets attached, but it's coming from, it's being expressed in an authentic African narrative. Yeah, like I said at the beginning.
Yeah. And I mean, just to build on that, I think that the big challenge is trying to learn from the kind of European experience, but make it customized to an African context, because I think the challenges are quite different. And we've seen some examples of trying to just transplant technologies and then that's IT technologies and materials technologies into local context. And we all know that doesn't go well without ground truthing it.
Thanks both for the inputs. Are there any further questions or thoughts from those joining us, or would like to add your own voice to this conversation? Asim Klengi.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Paul. I think mine is more towards what I see based on or what I've collected based on the conversation, and looking at information, IT, for instance, and ICT, and how it relates to information sharing I think going forward, or at least some of the opportunities that looking into circularity and sustainability is concerned, is that almost each partner in the system should have some sort of communication channel. I think it presents us with a unique opportunity, especially as far as sustainable cities and communities are concerned, that within a community that has a sustainability that is sustainability centric, that we are able to share ideas and learn from each other. So it then brings about issues of how do we then share information in a safe space, for instance, that information really builds and doesn't take away. And that's the and I think that shouldn't even be much of a concern, because circularity and sustainability itself, at least where we find ourselves currently, is that it opens it opens up such reach as far as the different aspects that one can influence. I think the biggest challenge, though, is then switching on that social engine for integration of circularity, and whether you take whichever approach, whether top down or not, but then, well, top down approaches, for instance, won't work, but then having a flow of information and within all these strata, so that you have definite impact and influence in all levels. I think those are just some of the biggest opportunities, at least as far as sustainable cities and communities are concerned.
Thanks for sharing. And I think you're touching on the point that so many different organizations have their own languages. And so you need them to communicate around sustainability from their own perspectives, because they've each differently around these topics. And we need a broker between to bring those different knowledges together. Any further inputs from our colleagues in the room before we close? So perhaps I'll hand to Yaya and then Brett for a closing reflection, and then we can close our discussion today.
I think it really is, as I said from the very beginning, honestly, wherever you are, I think what I would really say to you is that you really need to think deeply and seriously about this issues around circularity, issues around climate action and mitigation, adaptation, sustainability, and also most importantly, how do you contribute to growing a local green economy in your communities, in your country, whatever. No matter what sector you're in, you do have a role to play. This is quite simply going to be the single most important thing we probably all have to do for the rest of our lives. It's that serious. So this work should have started last week. I think we need to start last week, last month. We need to not move beyond the ideas, but also let the ideas, I think the last speaker just told, let the ideas play out, but where they now start to influence the action, they must filter in our common language. It's almost like when they talk about common, what's called interoperability of systems, but also these common common open network or standards. When you share ideas or a thing, and then it's usually for in the IP space, you need to have a similar thing around activities related to the circular economy. From my part, I would just like to share that we're doing our part here in Botswana. I mean, thank you to the African Circular Economy Network and the African Circular Economy Network Foundation. We are at a state of readiness now, engaging with the Ministry of Environment as the lead ministry on issues of environment and waste and the like. Now really trying to lay that initial conversation so that we can actually say, look, connect us to the government machinery, and also now play that role of convening so that we can actually lay this agenda out, get everybody under the one tent, and actually now start to get a common, concrete not just roadmap, but also an understanding that we all have a role to play. And you get to see whether that role can play, where you can do it, whether it's informing policy, whether it's actually industry transition for SMMEs to participate on a regeneration post-COVID, because it has to be climate neutral, it has to be green, but also digital transformation has a role to play. I think we keep touching on this issue of digital. It does have a role to play, but it's really around supporting the local context and where their priorities are. But once we've actually started doing the activity, so that journey mapping, and I think the systems now should actually now support that, because you're talking about scaling it so that it's almost like a dashboard. You can actually see that reporting, the interfaces, so that the systems are playing out. It's absolutely vital. Digital transformation does have a role to play. Then I also want to also let you all know that we have reached out to the government again in terms of the Sustainable Cities program for Botswana in my own capacity. Here we're actually talking to developing a Sustainable Cities program in the Botswana context. So we're looking to be included in Botswana's green GCF, Green Climate Fund country investment readiness program. We are actually in those conversations at this very moment. So I think this issue of circular cities in Botswana, it's also going to come out very clearly, hopefully very shortly. So I'm just trying to show you that even I found a way to play a part. Even wherever you are in your context, this is how literal it is. You find a way to play your part and connect into the way forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I look forward to see in the Sustainable Cities Botswana. Brett, I think I lost you for a moment. Please proceed. Yeah.
Sure. So I just want to start off, and I think there was one question that remains unanswered from Daniel, just about how governments are ensuring buy-in from product suppliers in implementing EPR. It was an earlier question, and the answer is that I think it's through penalties and fines and legal requirements for compliance, which I think helps me to reiterate one of the points I made earlier, that I think there's this combination of a regulatory environment that's required, coupled with the collaborative and voluntary networks that are set up. So it kind of supports that thought as well. I think maybe to build on Yame's final point, I think the closing remark I'd like to make is that we mustn't think of circular economy completely separately from other kind of key priority environmental issues. So you mentioned the Green Climate Fund, but I mean, there shouldn't be a separation between the work that's going on in climate mitigation and that's being done on circular economy. And certainly the latest IPCC report, which was released yesterday, has multiple references to circular economy. So there's a strong identification of the need for linking in with the climate efforts, and certainly, waste efforts are sometimes seen as end of pipe treatments rather than as part of the system that they are part of. And there are other people talking about resource efficiency or materials efficiency, and we've got to just be careful that these words don't separate the good work that everybody's doing, and rather try and work together, work with people who are working in all these different sometimes apparently separate domains. So I think that's my final point. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much. I think I'll just return us to the initial keywords that were put into the chat by our colleagues here for building meaningful partnership. And that's around trust, networking, mutual understanding, honesty, and transparency. And I think Christina's given us a very nice closing line, which is sustainable leadership means feeling responsible for other people's needs and resources. And I think that's a really nice framing of why collaboration for the circular economy is important. So thank you all for joining us. This is episode 3 of 6 of the Building Capacity for Circular Economy Innovation. Our next topic comes down to building circular human capital, and inspiration starts as early as kindergarten. So looking forward to that conversation on the 3rd of May. And just our work here in the ACE Africa program is done in partnership with Stellenbosch University Launch Lab, who are incubating a number of young and mature circular businesses, and the African Circular Economy Network, funded by the Fund for Local Cooperation of the Embassy of Finland to South Africa. So thank you everyone for joining. We'll send a digest of the session in a few days, as well as a link to the survey, because we'd like to know if the session has been useful to you and how we can improve our further engagements. So I wish you the best of the rest of the day, and see you very soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.